I never thought I'd be the mother who got publicly humiliated by her own son on a podcast with 2 million listeners. There I was, folding his childhood clothes I'd kept in tissue paper for 35 years, when I heard Darren's voice through my laptop speakers. My mum? She's old and useless, honestly. Never understood ambition or what it takes to build something real. The white cotton shirt with tiny blue sailboats slipped from my hands. 67 years of bedtime, stories, moral lessons, and gentle guidance. Reduced to those 4 words. But here's what my successful influencer's son doesn't know: every viral quote that built his empire came from our kitchen table conversations when he was 7 years old. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elaine Whitmore, and I suppose I should start at the beginning. Though at 76, beginnings feel more like excavations than fresh starts. The morning after what I now call the podcast incident, I sat in Jonas's old leather chair, the one that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, even though he'd been gone 10 years. His philosophy journal lay open on my lap, filled with his careful marginalia and underlined passages about truth, dignity, and the courage to speak when speaking feels impossible. Our house in Portland's Laurelhurst neighborhood had been Jonas's sanctuary and mine for 43 years. Every room held layers of memory like sediment: the kitchen where I'd grated papers while stirring soup, the living room where Darren had performed his first motivational speech at age 8, standing on the coffee table in his dinosaur pajamas, declaring that dreams are just plans, wearing their Sunday best. I'd written that phrase down in my teaching notebook the next morning, charmed by his earnestness. That phrase now sits on motivational posters across Instagram, attributed to Darren Whitmore, self-made entrepreneur and wisdom curator. No mention of dinosaur pajamas or Sunday mornings or the mother who taught him that words could be magic. I'd built my life around quiet contributions. As a literature professor at Portland State for 37 years, I'd guided thousands of students through the labyrinth of language, helping them find their voices while somehow losing track of my own. When Jonas died suddenly of a heart attack, still young at 68, still planning to write the book on practical philosophy he'd been outlining for decades, I folded in Word like paper and rain. Darren was 25 then, struggling with his first business venture, a motivational speaking company that existed mainly in his imagination and a borrowed conference room. I should have been grieving, should have been lost in the crater Jonas's absence had left in our daily routines. Instead, I found myself becoming my son's invisible foundation. When he doubted himself, I'd share stories from my classroom about persistence and growth. When he needed content for his early YouTube videos, I'd suggest themes from literature, philosophy, even fairy tales that could be reimagined for modern audiences. You know what Dad used to say, I tell him during our weekly dinners. The oak that stands tallest grew in the storm's embrace. Jonas had never said that I'd written it one restless night, thinking about resilience, but it sounded like something he would have said. And Darren needed the comfort of inherited wisdom. Over the years, those dinner conversations became the foundation of Darren's brand. His signature concepts are storm-grown strength, Sunday best dreams, dignity-driven success, all traced back to our kitchen table, to bedtime stories I told when he was small, to moral lessons wrapped in metaphor that a child could understand and an adult could build a career upon. I never asked for credit. Motherhood, I believed, was about giving freely, about watering roots that would someday support something larger than yourself. I watched with pride as Darren's following grew from hundreds to thousands to millions. His podcast, Intentional Living with Darren Whitmore, became a beacon for people seeking direction in chaotic times. His book, Storm Grown, Finding Strength in Life's Difficult Seasons, spent 18 weeks on bestseller lists. But somewhere in his ascent, I became an inconvenience to his narrative. Self-made entrepreneurs, apparently, aren't supposed to have mothers who shape their philosophy over breakfast and bedtime stories. The weekly dinners grew monthly, then quarterly. Phone calls became texts, then silence. When he did visit, usually with cameras for social media content, I was instructed to stay out of frame. It's about brand consistency, Mum, he'd explain. Not unkindly, but with the distant politeness reserved for strangers. My audience connects with the self-reliance message. Having family in the content complicates that. I accepted this new role as invisible supporter, even as it hollowed out something essential inside me. I told myself that his success was my success, that maternal love meant stepping into shadows so your child could shine in light you'd help create. My friend Monica Reynolds had other thoughts. Mo and I had taught together for 15 years before her retirement, and she'd watched Darren's career with increasingly sharp eyes. A former investigative journalist turned English professor, Mo had a talent for seeing through carefully constructed narratives. That boy is monetizing your wisdom, she'd say over coffee at our favorite cafe on Hawthorne. And you're letting him get away with it because you think that's what good mothers do. He's found his path, I'd reply, stirring sugar into my cup. With more force than necessary, isn't that what we want for our children? Path, yes. Amnesia about who built the road, no. But most concerns felt abstract until yesterday morning. Until I heard my son reduce 67 years of life experience to 4 brutal words. Old and useless. The podcast episode was called Breaking Free from Limiting Influences, and Darren's guest was another influencer discussing family expectations and generational trauma. When asked about his own family background, Darren had painted a picture of an overbearing mother who'd never understood his ambitions, who tried to keep him small and safe when he needed to grow dangerous and bold. I had to learn that just because someone raised you doesn't mean they know what's best for your future, he'd said, his voice carrying the confident cadence that had made him famous. My mum, she's old and useless, honestly. Never understood ambition or what it takes to build something real. Sometimes you have to cut ties with limiting influences, even family, to become who you're meant to be. 2 million listeners heard those words. 2 million strangers now knew that Darren Whitmore, wisdom curator and motivational powerhouse, considered his mother an obstacle to success rather than its secret architect. I'd sat in that leather chair for hours after hearing it, Jonas's journal growing heavy in my lap, watching rain streak down windows that looked out onto the garden we'd planted together decades ago. The roses were blooming again, the David Austin variety that Jonas had insisted would thrive in Portland's climate despite my skepticism. They'd proven him right year after year, even outlasting him, their deep pink petals unfurling with patient persistence. Perhaps it was time for me to remember what those roses knew about blooming in your own season, regardless of who thought. You were past your prime. My laptop sat closed on the coffee table, holding secrets I'd never thought to excavate. Somewhere in its digital memory were years of emails to Darren, messages filled with story ideas, philosophical musings, and gentle encouragement that had shaped his empire. Somewhere in this house were notebooks filled with my own thoughts, my own words, my own wisdom that had been borrowed and branded and sold to millions of people who'd never heard my name. I opened Jonas's journal to a page I'd marked years ago. His familiar handwriting steady and sure, truth delayed is not truth denied. Sometimes the world needs time to catch up to what we've always known. The storm was coming, and this old oak was ready to stand tall. The rain that had been threatening all week finally arrived Tuesday morning, drumming against my kitchen windows with the persistence of memory. I'd been awake since 4:30, nursing my second cup of coffee and staring at my wedding ring, a simple gold band that Jonas had slipped onto my finger 51 years ago, with promises about growing old together and sharing all our tomorrows. I'd removed it twice since his death and put it back on both times, unable to bear the pale circle of skin it left behind. But this morning, for the first time, I slid it off and set it on the kitchen table, studying how the morning light caught its worn surface. Some promises, I realized, weren't meant to last forever. Some were meant to teach you how to make new ones with yourself. The laptop sat open beside my coffee mug. The podcast episode paused at exactly the moment Darren's voice said old and useless. I'd listened to it 17 times since yesterday, each repetition carving the words deeper into my understanding of how completely I'd erased myself from my own story. But this morning brought a different kind of clarity, the kind that comes when you stop asking how could this happen and start asking what happens next. I clicked through to Darren's website, studying the polished photographs and carefully crafted biography that presented him as a self-made philosopher-entrepreneur. His About page was a masterpiece of personal branding. Born from humble beginnings in Portland, Oregon, Darren Whitmore overcame early limitations to become a leading voice in intentional living and personal transformation. Through trial, error, and relentless self-discovery, he developed the principles that now guide millions toward their most authentic lives. Humble beginnings. Early limitations. Not a word about the literature professor motherhood filled his childhood with. Stories about resilience. Who'd sat beside his bed every night for 12 years, creating the narrative frameworks that would later become his signature content. I scrolled through his most popular posts, recognizing my own words reflected back like moonlight on water, familiar, but somehow belonging to someone else. His top-viewed video from last month was titled The Sunday Best Philosophy: Why Dreams Need to Be Dressed for Success. 3 million views, 40,000 comments, and a direct quote from our kitchen table conversation when he was 8 years old. The cottage industry built around my son's wisdom included branded journals, storm-grown strength planners, online courses, dignity-driven Success Academy, and even a line of inspirational candles with names like Intentional Fire and Purposeful Light. Each product leveraged concepts I'd spent decades developing in my literature classes, stories I'd told to help him navigate childhood disappointments, metaphors I'd crafted to explain complex emotional truths in language a young mind could grasp. My phone buzzed against the table. A text from my neighbor Ivy. Saw the news trucks on Hawthorne this morning. Another influencer scandal. I glanced out the window. Ivy Mendoza lived in the small apartment above the garage that Jonas had converted into a rental unit when we needed extra income during my graduate school years. At 30, she was exactly the demographic that made up Darren's core audience: creative, ambitious, navigating the gap between dreams and financial reality. She worked part-time at Stumptown Coffee and spent her evenings building what she called my own creative empire, though she was refreshingly honest about the challenges. Unlike my son, Ivy understood that success rarely happened in isolation. No news trucks that I can see, I texted back. Just rain and regret. The regret's not yours to carry, came her immediate reply. Coffee at 2. I'm experimenting with lavender oat milk lattes and need a taste tester who won't lie about whether they're terrible. Ivy had moved in 2 years ago, shortly after a breakup had left her scrambling for affordable housing in Portland's increasingly expensive market. I'd been hesitant about renting to someone so young. My experience with 20-somethings was limited to the classroom, but she'd won me over during our first conversation by mentioning that she'd read all of Jonas's published articles on practical philosophy. Your husband understood something that most people miss, she'd said, sitting in my living room with perfect posture and earnest eyes. That wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions. She'd become the daughter I'd never had, the friend who saw me as something more than Darren's outdated mother. When she'd started her own blog about sustainable living and creative entrepreneurship, I'd offered to help with editing and research. Unlike Darren, she insisted on crediting my contributions, listing me as editorial advisor, and frequently citing conversations we'd had as inspiration for her posts. Experience isn't something you accumulate, she'd written in a piece about learning from older generations. It's something that accumulates in you, changing your shape like water carving stone. The wisest people I know understand that there, both the river and the rock. That metaphor had come from one of our kitchen conversations. But Ivy had asked permission before using it and had insisted on attribution. The contrast with Darren's approach was both stark and painful. My laptop chimed with a notification. Another comment on Darren's latest post, this one from someone called it Storm-Grown Soul. Your content literally saved my life during my divorce. The dignity-driven success framework helped me rebuild everything. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with the world. 47 likes and counting. I wondered what its storm-grown soul would think if they knew that dignity-driven success had originated during a conversation about how to handle bullies on the playground, when 7-year-old Darren had come home with a black eye and wounded pride. Sometimes I told him while dabbing antiseptic on scraped knuckles, the strongest thing you can do is walk away with your dignity intact. Success isn't about proving you're tougher than everyone else. It's about staying true to who you are even when the world tries to make you smaller. He nodded solemnly, the way children do when they sense they're receiving something important, even if they don't fully understand it yet. The next day he'd walked away from another confrontation, head high and shoulders straight. Dignity-driven, he'd announced at dinner, pleased with his new vocabulary. I'd smiled and praised his maturity, never imagining that phrase would someday generate millions of dollars in revenue while I remained invisible in my own kitchen, listening to my son explain to strangers why he'd had to overcome the limitations of his upbringing. The rain was intensifying, sending rivulets down the windows, in patterns that reminded me of tears. But I wasn't crying anymore. Something else was building inside me, not anger exactly, but a kind of crystallizing purpose that felt both frightening and necessary. I opened a new browser tab and searched for how to start a blog. The results overwhelmed me immediately. Hosting services, domain names, content management systems, SEO optimization strategies. The technical vocabulary felt like learning a new language at 76, which I supposed was exactly what it was. But then I remembered Ivy's offer to help with anything I needed, and her expertise with digital platforms that I'd watched her navigate with the fluency of her generation. Maybe starting over didn't have to mean starting alone. I saved Darren's childhood notebook from the hallway closet, a composition book, with his careful handwriting documenting stories I'd told him. Phrases he'd found particularly meaningful, even crude drawings of characters from my improvised bedtime tales. On page 12, in his 8-year-old script, Mom says dreams are plans wearing Sunday best. That means you have to dress them up and take them somewhere nice. Beside it, a drawing of a stick figure in what appeared to be a fancy dress, holding hands with a smaller stick figure labeled my dream. I photographed the page with my phone, studying the image on the small screen. Evidence, documentation, proof that the empire built on authenticity and self-discovery had been constructed from borrowed wisdom and uncredited inspiration. But more than that, proof that once upon a time, my son had loved my stories enough to write them down, to illustrate them with careful attention, to preserve them in permanent ink because they meant something to him. The question now was whether that love still existed beneath the brand, beneath the public persona that required me to be an obstacle rather than an origin. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Ivy. Changed my mind about to PM. Can you come now? I have an idea about something, and waiting feels impossible. I looked around my kitchen at the wedding ring sitting beside my coffee mug, at the laptop screen full of my son's borrowed wisdom, at Jonas's journal open to a page about courage and timing. The rain continued its patient drumming, and somewhere in its rhythm I heard something that sounded like encouragement. It was time to go get dressed for success. Ivy's apartment above the garage had been transformed since her move-in day 2 years ago. What had once been Jonas's sparse office space, exposed beams, concrete floors, and the minimum furniture necessary for occasional use now felt like a creative sanctuary. Tapestries in jewel tones softened the hard edges, plants cascaded from every available surface, and the walls were covered with inspiration boards, sketches, and photographs that told the story of someone building a life from scratch with intention. And she opened the door wearing paint-splattered overalls and an expression of barely contained excitement. Her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun secured with what appeared to be a paintbrush. "Perfect timing," she said, stepping aside. "To let me in. I just finished something that's either brilliant or completely insane, and I need an objective opinion." The apartment smelled like coffee and lavender, with undertones of acrylic paint, and the rosemary she grew in parts along the windowsill. Her laptop sat open on a desk made from reclaimed wood, surrounded by notebooks, colored pens, and a collection of succulents in hand-painted parts. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a comfortable chair she'd upholstered herself in fabric that reminded me of peacock feathers. "Coffee first, then revelation." She handed me a ceramic mug, one of her own creations, glazed in swirls of blue and green, filled with something that smelled like heaven and tasted even better. The lavender oat milk latte was perfect, creamy and floral without being overwhelming. "This is incredible," I said, taking another sip. "You could sell these." "Funny you should mention selling things," Ivy said, settling into the chair across from me with her own mug. "Because that's exactly what I want to talk about." She reached for her laptop and turned the screen toward me. A blog post draft filled the page, titled "The Invisible Architects: When Your Heroes Don't Give Credit Where It's Due." My heart stuttered. "Ivy ... double quotes before you say anything. Just listen." Her voice carried the passionate intensity I'd learned to associate with her best ideas. I was doing research for my Sustainable Business Ethics series, and I kept thinking about our conversation last week about attribution and credit in creative industries. You mentioned how frustrating it was when students would cite sources poorly. But then you said something that stuck with me. She scrolled down to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. "The most damaging theft isn't stealing someone's work, it's stealing their story." When you take not just what someone created, but the narrative of how it came to exist, you erase not just their contribution, but their very right to have contributed. I recognized my own words, spoken during one of our kitchen table conversations, about academic integrity and the importance of citation. But seeing them in Ivy's blog context made them feel suddenly prophetic. "I've been following your son's career for years," she continued, her voice gentle but determined. "Even before I moved here, I was a huge fan of his content. The wisdom felt so authentic, so grounded in real understanding rather than the superficial motivation speak that floods social media." She opened another tab, showing Darren's Instagram feed. "But then I got to know you, and I started recognizing patterns. The metaphors, the specific way he phrases concepts about resilience and dignity, even some of the stories he tells about learning life lessons, they all sound like you." My coffee cup trembled slightly in my hands. "I never told you ... You didn't have to tell me directly. But when someone shares wisdom the way you do in conversation, in the way you approach problems, in the stories you tell about your students, and your marriage patterns emerge." And when I heard that podcast episode ... She didn't need to finish. We both knew which episode she meant. "I got angry," Ivy said simply, "really angry. The kind of angry that makes you want to do something rather than just feel something." She clicked to another document, this one showing what appeared to be a side-by-side comparison. On the left, screenshots of Darren's most popular posts and quotes. On the right, Notes that looked like they'd been compiled from our conversations over the past 2 years. I started documenting, she said, not to invade your privacy or betray confidences, but because I kept hearing echoes. Your voice in his voice, your stories becoming his content, the evidence was undeniable. Phrase after phrase, concept after concept, all traceable to conversations we'd had over coffee, during evening walks, while tending the garden. Ivy had been listening not just as a friend, but as someone who understood the value of intellectual property and the importance of giving credit where it was due. The question, she said, closing the laptop and leaning forward, is what you want to do about it. I set down my coffee cup and walked to her window, looking out at the main house where I'd spent decades nurturing a son who now considered me a limiting influence. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the garden looked fresh and green, ready for whatever season came next. I don't want revenge, I said finally, but I'm tired of being invisible. Then don't be, Ivy said. Tell your story. Not to hurt him, but to reclaim yourself. She joined me at the window, her presence solid and reassuring beside me. I've been building my platform for 2 years, learning everything I can about digital storytelling and authentic engagement. I know how to create content that reaches people, how to use social media as a tool for connection rather than just promotion. I turned to look at her. What are you suggesting? Partnership, she said. You have the story. I have the technical skills. Together, we could create something that honors your wisdom while also addressing the larger issue of how our culture treats older voices, especially women's voices. The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. At 76, I was being offered the chance to step into digital spaces I'd never imagined navigating, to reclaim a voice I'd spent decades sublimating to other people's needs. Would anyone care? I asked, about an old woman's perspective on her son's success. Ivy laughed, but not unkindly. Elaine, do you realize how many people are hungry for authentic wisdom? How tired they are of polished influencers who've never struggled with anything more serious than which brand deal to accept. Your story, a mother who gave freely, who supported from the shadows, who finally decided to step into the light that's not just compelling content. That's revolutionary. She moved back to her desk and opened a new document. We start with a simple blog post. Your story, in your voice, but with enough evidence to make it clear that this isn't just family drama. This is about attribution, about the invisible labor that women have been providing for generations, about what happens when society decides that certain voices don't matter. My phone buzzed with a text notification. Darren, dinner this Sunday, having some friends over for content creation, but thought you might want to stop by. I showed the message to Ivy, who read it with raised eyebrows. Content creation dinner, she said. How romantic. He's not a bad person, I said, surprising myself with the defensiveness in my voice. He's just lost in his own narrative, maybe, Ivy said. But that doesn't mean you have to stay lost in it too. I looked around her apartment again, taking in all the evidence of someone who'd built a life and career with intention and authenticity. Plans that were thriving because she'd learned their specific needs. Art that reflected her personal aesthetic rather than what might be popular. A business built on genuine expertise rather than borrowed wisdom. If we do this, I said slowly, it changes everything. My relationship with Darren, my quiet life, the way people see me. Yes, Ivy said. It does, and there's no going back. No, she agreed. There isn't. I thought about Jonas's journal, about his notes on courage and timing. I thought about the roses in our garden, blooming year after year regardless of who noticed or appreciated their persistence. I thought about the thousands of students I'd taught over the decades and how I'd always encourage them to find their voices, to speak their truths, to refuse to let others define their worth. Maybe it was time to take my own advice, Okay, I said. Let's do it. Ivy's smile could have powered the entire neighborhood. Really? Really, I felt something inside me settling into place, like a puzzle piece finally finding its proper position. But I have conditions. Name them. We don't attack him personally. This isn't about destroying Darren's career or humiliating him publicly. It's about telling my story and letting people draw their own conclusions. Agreed. And we focus on the larger issues you mentioned: attribution, invisible labor, though, voices that get overlooked. My situation with Darren is the example, but the real conversation is bigger than us. Perfect, Ivy said, already making notes. That's exactly the approach that will resonate with people. And, I said, the final condition coming to me as I spoke it, we do this with dignity. No matter how people respond, no matter what Darren's reaction is, we handle this with grace. Ivy nodded solemnly. Dignity-driven approach, she said, then caught herself and laughed. Sorry, that phrase is everywhere now. It should be, I said. It's good advice. We spent the next hour outlining the blog post, with Ivy asking questions that helped me organize my thoughts and memories into a coherent narrative. She understood intuitively how to structure a story for maximum emotional impact. While maintaining journalistic integrity, we need photos, she said as we wrapped up. Documentation, the childhood notebook you mentioned, maybe some of your old teaching materials, anything that shows the evolution of these ideas. I have everything, I said. Jonas saved everything, and I've never been able to throw any of it away. Grief has its purposes, Ivy said gently. Sometimes what we save in sadness becomes useful in unexpected ways. As I prepared to leave, she handed me a manila folder. Homework, she said. Research on viral storytelling, platform building, and managing public response to personal narratives. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. I tucked the folder under my arm and headed for the door, but Ivy's voice stopped me. Elaine, are you scared? I considered the question seriously. Terrified, I admitted, but also excited for the first time in years. I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of just maintaining what already exists. That's how you know it's the right choice, she said. The rain had stopped completely by the time I reached my back door, and the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in golden light. The garden looked particularly beautiful, as if it had been waiting all day for this moment of illumination. Inside, I found Jonas's journal still open to the page about truth and timing. But now, instead of feeling like a burden, his words felt like permission. I had a story to tell, and finally, I had the courage to tell it. Thursday morning brought an envelope from Monica Reynolds, delivered by hand and tucked under my front door, while I was still in my bathrobe, nursing my first coffee, and reviewing Ivy's research materials. Mo had clearly been busy since our last conversation. The envelope contained a newspaper clipping from the Oregonian, dated just 3 days ago, with a headline that made my heart skip. The Grey Revolution: How Women Over 50 Are Reclaiming Digital Spaces. The article featured interviews with women who'd started successful online businesses, blogs, and social media platforms after decades of putting their own ambitions aside for family and career obligations that prioritized others' success over their own. One 68-year-old grandmother had built a cooking channel with 3 million subscribers. A 72-year-old former librarian had created a book review blog that publishers now consulted before major launches. A 59-year-old empty nester had parlayed her organizational skills into a home management empire that employed 12 people. Mo had circled several quotes in red ink, her commentary filling the margins in handwriting I'd known for 15 years. Next to a quote about invisible expertise finally finding its platform, she'd written, "This is your moment, Elaine. Stop waiting for permission. My phone rang before I could fully process the implications. Mo's voice, as always, came through, clear and determined. Did you read it just now? How did you? I have contacts at the paper from my journalism days. When I heard about what Darren said on that podcast, I called in a favour and asked if they'd be interested in a follow-up story about mothers whose contributions have been erased from their children's success stories. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I nearly dropped the phone. Mo, you didn't relax. I didn't mention you specifically, but I did plan to seed about the larger trend, and my contact is very interested. The grey revolution angle is hot right now, especially stories about intellectual property and family dynamics. I sank into Jonas's chair, the newspaper clipping fluttering to the floor. I'm not ready for reporters. You're not ready to stay invisible either, Mo said gently, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I want to help, and I think you need to understand what's happening in the bigger picture. She explained that she'd been monitoring Darren's social media presence since the podcast episode, tracking engagement patterns and audience response. What she discovered was both fascinating and troubling. His audience is starting to question him, she said. Not directly, not in ways that would show up as negative comments, but there's a shift in the tone. People are asking for more personal content, more backstory, more authenticity. They're hungry for the real story behind the wisdom. I pulled up Darren's Instagram on my laptop while we talked, scrolling through recent posts with Mo's analysis in mind. She was right, the comments showed a subtle but noticeable shift. Instead of simple praise and gratitude, people were asking questions. Where did you learn this? Who taught you to think this way? What was your childhood like that shaped these insights? It's like they sense something's missing, Mo continued. And that missing piece is you. The irony wasn't lost on me. Darren's carefully constructed narrative of self-made success was creating a hunger for the very thing he'd erased: the family context, the generational wisdom, the human connections that had actually shaped his philosophy. There's something else, Mo said, her voice carrying a note I'd learned to recognize as investigative excitement. I've been cross-referencing his content with academic sources, and some of his core concepts are surprisingly sophisticated, too. Sophisticated for someone without formal training in literature and philosophy. He was an English major for 2 years before switching to business, I said. 2 years of undergraduate English doesn't explain the depth of literary reference in his work, or the philosophical frameworks he uses. Elaine, this goes deeper than borrowed phrases. He's been using your entire educational background as his foundation. The realization hit me like cold water. It wasn't just my bedtime stories and kitchen table conversations that Darren had appropriated. It was my decades of academic training, my graduate education in comparative literature, my familiarity with philosophical texts that most people never encountered. When he quoted Marcus Aurelius or referenced narrative structures from classical mythology, he was drawing on knowledge I'd accumulated through years of study and teaching. I need to document this, I said, thinking of Ivy's research methods and the growing folder of evidence we'd been compiling. Already on it, Mo said. I've been creating a bibliography of concepts and references that appear in his work, cross-checked with your academic publications and teaching materials. If you are serious about telling your story, you need to be able to prove not just that he borrowed your words, but that he borrowed your education. After we hung up, I spent the morning going through boxes I hadn't opened since Jonas's death files from my teaching career, copies of papers I'd published, syllabi from courses I'd developed over nearly 4 decades in academia. The volume of material was overwhelming, but patterns emerged as I worked. Here was a paper I'd written on resilience narratives in children's literature, published 15 years ago in an obscure academic journal. The central thesis that children's stories function as philosophical frameworks for adult problem-solving had become the backbone of Darren's approach to motivational content. Here was a syllabus from my mythology and modern life course, where I'd help students identify archetypal patterns in contemporary challenges. Darren's most popular workshop series, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Warriors, used the exact same structure and many of the same examples. Here was a collection of creative writing exercises I'd developed to help students find their authentic voices exercises that had been repurposed as the signature methodology in Darren's online course, Intentional Storytelling for Personal Growth. The evidence was damning, but also heartbreaking. Every borrowed concept represented not just intellectual theft, but a missed opportunity for genuine collaboration. If Darren had acknowledged my contributions, we could have built something together. Mother-son team combining academic rigor with contemporary relevance, generational wisdom with modern platforms. Instead, he'd chosen a narrative that required my my phone buzzed with a text from Ivy. How's the documentation going? I'm writing the intro to our blog post and want to make sure the tone is right. I called her instead of texting back, needing to hear a friendly voice in the middle of all this evidence of betrayal. It's worse than I thought, I told her, explaining most discoveries and my morning of archaeological excavation through old files. Worse or better? Ivy asked, because from a storytelling perspective, this makes your case even stronger. It's not just about a few borrowed phrases, it's about systemic appropriation of your life's work. She was right, but the weight of it felt enormous. How do we write about this without sounding bitter or vindictive? By focusing on what you're trying to create rather than what was taken away, Ivy said. This isn't about tearing down Darren's success. It's about building something new, recognition for invisible contributions, platform for overlooked voices, conversation about how wisdom really gets transmitted between generations. We talked through the structure of the blog post with Ivy, suggesting that we frame it as a love letter to all the unrecognized contributors whose work had been appropriated by others. My story would be the anchor, but the real message would be about systemic change. What about his response? I asked. When this goes public, Darren's going to have to address it somehow. That's his choice to make, Ivy said. Our job is to tell your truth with integrity and let the chips fall where they may. After lunch, I decided to drive past Darren's studio in southeast Portland, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I needed to see the physical space where my words had been transformed into someone else's brand. Or maybe I was looking for some sign of the sun I'd raised amid all the professional polish. The building was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a minimalist aesthetic that screamed expensive rental. Through the glass, I could see state-of-the-art recording equipment, professional lighting setups, and branded backdrops that had become instantly recognizable to his millions of followers. Darren was visible inside, apparently recording content with two other people I didn't recognize. Even from the parking lot, I could see his animated gestures, the confident presence that had made him famous. He looked successful, professional, completely in his element, but he also looked like a stranger, the boy who'd once drawn pictures to illustrate my bedtime stories, who'd written down my phrases in careful handwriting because they meant something to him, who'd stood on our coffee table in dinosaur pajamas declaring that dreams needed Sunday best. That boy had disappeared somewhere inside the brand. As I watched, Darren launched into what appeared to be an explanation of one of his core concepts, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. Even through the glass, I could see the passion in his posture, the genuine belief in what he was sharing. The tragedy wasn't that he was a fraud, it was that he wasn't. He truly believed in the wisdom he was sharing, had internalized it so completely that he'd forgotten where it came from. In erasing me from his narrative, he'd also erased his own authentic origin story. My phone rang. Darren? Mom? I saw your car in our parking lot. Is everything okay? I looked up at the studio windows and saw him holding his phone, looking out with an expression of concern and confusion. I'm fine, I said. Just driving around. Thinking, do you want to come in? We're wrapping up a session. But I could give you a tour of the new space. The invitation was genuine, but also clearly inconvenient. I could see his colleagues checking their phones, probably calculating how much this interruption was costing in terms of productivity and momentum. Another time, I said, I should get home. Mum ... double quotes. His voice carried something I hadn't heard in years: uncertainty. About the podcast thing, if you heard it, I just want you to know that wasn't really about you. It was more about, the general concept of limiting beliefs. I understand, I said, which was true. I did understand. I understood exactly how completely he'd rewritten our family history to serve his professional needs. Okay, good. I was worried you might have taken it personally. After we hung up, I sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, watching my son through the studio windows as he returned to his recording session. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd built something meaningful, who was sharing valuable wisdom with people who needed it. He wasn't wrong about the value of what he was offering. He was just wrong about where it had come from. By the time I got home, the late afternoon light was painting the house in warm tones that reminded me of the early days, when Darren was small, and our conversations about dreams and dignity happened naturally around the dinner table, without cameras or audience or agenda beyond a mother's desire to help her child navigate the world with wisdom and grace. Those conversations had been gifts, given freely with no expectation of return. But gifts didn't have to remain anonymous forever. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was to remind someone where their treasures had originally come from. Friday evening, I sat in Ivy's apartment with her laptop open between us, the cursor blinking at the top of a blank document titled The Wisdom Keepers, a mother's story of love, loss, and reclaimed voice. We'd spent the week gathering documentation, refining our approach, and building courage for what we both knew would be a moment of no return. Ready? Ivy asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. I nodded, though my heart was racing. Ready? What we created over the next 3 hours wasn't just a blog post, it was an excavation, a reclamation, a love letter to truth that neither of us could have written alone. Ivy's technical skill and storytelling instincts combined with my lifetime of accumulated wisdom and carefully preserved evidence to create something that felt both personal and universal. We started with Cameron, my 12-year-old grandson, because children have a way of cutting through complex family dynamics to the essential truth. 2 weeks earlier, he'd called me from his bedroom, ostensibly to ask for help with a school project about family history, but really because he'd overheard his parents arguing about the podcast episode. Grandma Elaine, he'd said, his voice small and confused. Dad says you don't understand his work, but you're the one who taught him all those stories about being brave and kind. I still have the notebook, where I write down the things you tell me, just like Dad used to. That notebook, Cameron's current version of the composition book Darren had kept as a child, contained the same types of wisdom, the same storytelling patterns, the same philosophical frameworks that had shaped his father's worldview. The difference was that Cameron still knew where the wisdom came from. He still tells your stories, Cameron had continued, in his videos and stuff. He just doesn't say they're yours anymore. Out of the mouths of babes. We wove that conversation into the introduction, using Cameron's perspective to illustrate how wisdom travels between generations, and how the source of that wisdom can become obscured when narratives are reshaped for public consumption. Then we moved into my own story, not as an attack on Darren, but as an example of a larger phenomenon that Ivy had been researching for weeks. The systematic erasure of older women's intellectual contributions, particularly in families where those contributions had been given freely and without formal recognition. This isn't unusual. Ivy had written in her research notes. Mothers, grandmothers, teachers, mentors, women who've spent decades nurturing others' success often find themselves written out of the success stories they helped create. Their wisdom becomes folk knowledge or common sense rather than intellectual property worth crediting. We included photos of Darren's childhood notebook, pages of my academic papers that had influenced his philosophical framework, side-by-side comparisons of my teaching materials and his workshop content. But we also included context quotes from other women whose contributions had been similarly overlooked, statistics about gender, and age bias in intellectual attribution, examples of how this pattern played out across industries and families. The most powerful section came when we addressed the deeper injury, not just the theft of credit, but the rewriting of family history in ways that made the contributor into an obstacle rather than an architect. When someone appropriates not just your ideas, but your role in their story, I wrote, they don't just steal your intellectual property. They steal your relationship. They transform love into limitation, wisdom into burden, support into opposition. But we also included love, memories of Darren as a child, pride in his genuine desire to help people, acknowledgement of the real value he was bringing to his audience. This wasn't a takedown piece, it was a complexity piece, an exploration of how families navigate the intersection of personal relationships and public success. I don't want to diminish what my son has built, we wrote near the end. I want to add to it. I want to be part of the conversation instead of a footnote erased from it. I want my grandson to know that wisdom has sources, that stories of origins, that standing on someone's shoulders doesn't diminish your own height, it just means you should acknowledge the foundation. As we worked, Ivy handled all the technical aspects: formatting, image optimization, social media strategy, even preliminary outreach to bloggers and journalists who covered issues related to family dynamics and generational wisdom. We need to be prepared for this to spread quickly, she warned as we finalized the post. The combination of family drama, social media culture critique, and generational conflict is basically internet catnip. Once this goes live, you'll lose control of how it's interpreted and discussed. The weight of that reality settled over me as I read through our final draft. In less than 2,000 words, we told a story that would fundamentally change my relationship with my son, my role in his public narrative, and my own identity as someone who'd spent decades in the shadows. Last chance to back out, Ivy said gently, her cursor hovering over the publish button. I thought about Jonas's journal, about the roses in our garden that bloomed year after year regardless of recognition. I thought about Cameron's notebook, and the wisdom that was still flowing between generations even when its source was being systematically erased. I thought about the women in Mo's newspaper article, who'd found their voices and platforms at ages when society expected them to fade into irrelevance. Publish it, I said. The blog went live at 8:47 p.m. on a Friday night, initially reaching only Ivy's modest following of sustainable living enthusiasts and creative entrepreneurs. We'd planned it that way, a soft launch that would give us time to monitor initial responses and adjust our approach if necessary. Within an hour, we had 12 comments, all supportive and thoughtful. By midnight, the post had been shared 43 times across various social media platforms. Ivy checked analytics obsessively, watching the view count climb steadily as people discovered and shared our story. It's happening, she said, showing me the dashboard that tracked real-time engagement. Look at this, shares are coming from accounts with huge followings, mom bloggers, women's rights advocates, even some verified accounts in the media space. I spent Saturday morning responding to comments and messages. overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from strangers who recognized their own experiences in my story. Women whose sons had built careers on their intellectual contributions. Mothers whose creative work had been appropriated by children who'd grown embarrassed by their humble origins. Grandmothers whose wisdom had been repackaged and monetized without acknowledgement. This happened to me with my daughter's catering business, wrote one commenter. All her signature recipes were mine, but when she got famous, suddenly I was just the mom who taught her basic cooking instead of the chef who developed the flavor profiles that made her successful. My son's TED Talk was basically a word-for-word version of conversations we'd had when he was struggling with career direction, shared another. 2 million views, book deal, speaking tour. I got a generic Mother's Day card, but the response that moved me most came from a young man in his 20s. This made me realize I need to call my mom and thank her for all the common sense that's actually her hard-won wisdom. I've been presenting her ideas as my own for so long I forgot they weren't originally mine. By Sunday morning, the post had been viewed over 50,000 times and shared across platforms by influencers, journalists, and ordinary people who found something in our story that resonated with their own experiences. Ivy was fielding interview requests from podcasters and bloggers who wanted to explore the themes we'd raised. "The New York Times wants to talk to you," she said, showing me an email from a journalist who covered family dynamics and social media culture. So does NPR. And about 12 different podcasts focused on women's issues and generational relationships. The attention was exhilarating and terrifying. At 76, I was about to become a public figure, a voice in conversations I'd only observed from the margins. But more than that, I was about to become myself again, not just Darren's mother, or Jonas's widow, but Elaine Whitmore, a woman with her own wisdom, her own story, her own right to be heard. My phone had been conspicuously silent all weekend. No text from Darren, no calls, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. I knew he'd seen the post. His social media activity had stopped abruptly Saturday morning, and Ivy's analytics showed multiple views from Portland IP addresses associated with his business. Sunday evening, as I was preparing for bed, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Darren standing on my front porch, holding what appeared to be a printout of our blog post, the conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating for 48 hours was finally about to begin. I opened the door to find my son transformed. Gone was the polished confidence I'd seen through the studio windows just days earlier. Darren stood on my porch looking younger than his 35 years, clutching our printed blog post like evidence in a trial where he couldn't decide if he was the defendant or the victim. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying none of the practiced authority that millions of followers had come to recognize. I stepped aside to let him in, noting how his presence seemed to shrink the familiar spaces of our home. The living room where he'd once performed his first motivational speech suddenly felt too small for both his current persona and the memories it contained. He sat heavily in Jonas's chair, the same leather seat where I'd spent the week reading philosophy and gathering courage. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. 50,000 views, he said, setting the printout on the coffee table between us. 50,000 people now think I'm a fraud who stole his mother's wisdom. Is that what you think it says? I asked, settling into the chair across from him. Isn't it? His voice cracked slightly. Mum, this post is basically a detailed accusation that I built my entire career on plagiarized content. I studied his face, searching for the boy who'd once written down my stories in careful handwriting because they meant something to him. What do you think plagiarism means, Darren? Taking someone else's work and presenting it as your own. The answer came automatically, probably remembered from some college course he'd taken decades ago. And is that what you did? The question hung in the air between us. I could see him wrestling with it. His marketing-trained brain probably calculating damage control strategies while some deeper part of him grappled with truths he'd been avoiding for years. You're my mother. The things you taught me, they became part of me. I didn't think of them as someone else's work. I thought of them as lessons, family wisdom. And family wisdom doesn't need attribution. Not when you're trying to build credibility as an independent voice. Mom, you have to understand the influencer space is brutal. People are looking for any reason to tear you down, any sign that you're not authentic or self-made. If I'd started every video with my mother taught me this, I would have been dismissed as a mama's boy who couldn't think for himself. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the same pain I'd experienced when grading papers from students who'd chosen expediency over integrity, who'd convinced themselves that good intentions justified questionable methods. So you chose to erase me instead. I chose to protect my brand. The words came out defensive, then seemed to hit him like a physical blow. God, that sounds terrible when I say it out loud. It sounds honest, I said gently, which is more than you've been with me in years. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of accumulated deception settling between us like dust. Through the window, I could see evening shadows stretching across the garden Jonas and I had planted together, the roses still blooming despite the approaching season's change. The podcast, Darren said, finally, calling you old and useless. That was ... cruel, I finished, and untrue, and designed to hurt me in the most public way possible. It wasn't designed to hurt you. You weren't supposed to be listening. That makes it worse, not better. I leaned forward, needing him to understand. Darren, you reduced your mother, the woman who taught you everything you know about resilience and dignity, to an obstacle in your success story. You told to million strangers that I was a limiting influence you had to overcome. His hands were shaking now, the printout crumpling slightly in his grip. I was trying to make a point about not letting other people's expectations hold you back, by using me as an example of someone whose expectations were holding you back. Yes, the admission was barely a whisper, even though my expectations were never about holding you back. They were about helping you become the best version of yourself, I know. Tears were threatening now, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. I know that. I've always known that. The room felt suddenly smaller, filled with 35 years of shared history that neither of us could escape or deny. This was the son I'd raised, the boy who'd cried in my arms after nightmares, who turned to me for comfort when the world felt too big and frightening. But he was also the man who'd found it necessary to erase me from his story in order to tell it the way he thought it needed to be told. Your audience is responding to the blog post, I said, showing him my phone with dozens of new comments and messages. They're not angry at you. They're curious about the real story. He scrolled through the responses, his expression shifting from defensive to surprised. They want to know more about you. They want to know more about the truth, about where wisdom really comes from, how it gets transmitted, why it matters to acknowledge our sources. Some of these people are saying they want to hear both sides of the story, he said, continuing to read. They want us to talk together, to explore what this means for families and authenticity in the digital age. I felt a flutter of possibility in my chest. What do you think about that? I think ... double quotes. He set down the phone and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the house. I think I've been terrified of sharing the spotlight because I was afraid people would realize you were the one with the real wisdom. The honesty in his voice was devastating and healing simultaneously. But you do have real wisdom, Darren. You've taken the foundations I gave you and built something meaningful. You've helped millions of people find direction and purpose. That's not fake, that's transformation. Transformation of your ideas. Transformation of our ideas. The conversations we had weren't one-way lectures. You asked questions, made connections, added your own insights. You took what I gave you and made it accessible to people I never could have reached. He leaned back in Jonas's chair, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. So what happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. I want ... double quotes. He paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever he was about to say. I want to tell the real story, not a damage control version or a PR-friendly narrative, but the actual truth about how my philosophy developed and who helped shape it, even if it means acknowledging that you're not entirely self-made. Especially if it means that, he managed a small smile. Besides, self-made is starting to feel like a pretty lonely place to be. We talked until nearly midnight, planning what would become the most honest content Darren had ever created. Not a defensive response to my blog post, but a genuine exploration of how wisdom moves between generations, how families navigate the intersection of personal relationships and public success, how authenticity sometimes requires admitting that you don't have all the answers on your own. I want you to be part of it, he said as we wrapped up. Not as damage control, but as a collaborator. The audience that's responding to your story, they want to hear your voice, not just hear about your voice. The idea thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. At 76, I was being invited to step into digital spaces I'd never imagined occupying, to share platforms with millions of people who are hungry for authentic wisdom and genuine connection. Your audience is used to polished content, I warned. I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not just to fit into your brand aesthetic. Good, Darren said. I'm tired of pretending too. As he prepared to leave, he picked up the printout of our blog post one more time. Mum, in all of this, in everything I took without asking, in all the ways I erased you from the story ... Why didn't you ever say anything before? I thought about the question, about the decades of small erasures that had led to this moment of reckoning, because I thought loving you meant making myself smaller so you could be bigger. I thought that's what mothers were supposed to do. And now I think loving you means showing you that there's room for both of us to be exactly as big as we're meant to be. He hugged me, then the first genuine embrace we'd shared in months. And I felt something shift between us, like a bone setting back into proper alignment after a long fracture. After he left, I sat in the quiet house surrounded by evidence of the week that had changed everything. The blog post printout lay on the coffee table next to Jonas's journal, next to my laptop screen, still showing hundreds of supportive comments from strangers who'd found their own stories reflected in mine. Tomorrow would bring media interviews, collaborative content creation, and the strange new reality of being a public voice in conversations about family, authenticity, and the courage to claim credit for your own contributions. But tonight, I sat in my own living room feeling like myself for the first time in years, not just Darren's mother or Jonas's widow, but Elaine Whitmore, a woman with wisdom worth sharing and a story worth telling. The roses in the garden would bloom again next year. And this time, they wouldn't be the only ones. The interview request from Sarah Chen at Modern Family Dynamics, a podcast with over 3 million subscribers, arrived Monday morning while I was still processing the weekend's emotional conversations with Darren. What made this opportunity different from the dozens of other media requests was that Sarah wanted to interview both of us together, not as opposing sides in a family drama, but as a case study in how families could navigate intellectual property, creative collaboration, and generational wisdom in the digital age. This is huge, Ivy said, reviewing the email in my kitchen while we planned my week of media appearances. Sarah Chen is basically the gold standard for thoughtful family content. She doesn't do gotcha journalism or sensationalism, her audience combs for genuine insight and authentic conversation. Darren arrived at noon with his recording equipment, to camera operators, and an expression of nervous determination I hadn't seen since his high school debate competitions. The professional setup in my living room felt surreal, lights and microphones transforming the space, where we did countless private conversations into a stage for public reconciliation. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as his team finished their technical preparations. "I've been ready for this conversation for years," I said. "I just didn't know it would happen in front of 3 million people." Sarah Chen joined us via video call from her San Francisco studio, her presence immediately warm and professional. She'd clearly done her research not just about our viral blog post, but about my academic background, Darren's career trajectory, and the larger cultural conversations our story had sparked. Before we dive into specifics, she began, "I want to establish context for our listeners. Elaine, you're a retired literature professor with nearly 4 decades of teaching experience. Darren, you're a successful motivational speaker and content creator with millions of followers. How did those two paths intersect to create the situation we're discussing today?" I found myself telling the story chronologically for the first time, not as accusation or defense, but as narrative. The bedtime stories and kitchen table conversations that had shaped Darren's worldview. The academic frameworks I'd shared to help him understand complex emotional concepts. The gradual transformation of private family wisdom into public content, and the equally gradual erasure of my role in that transformation. Darren's contributions were revelatory, both for the podcast audience and for me. He described the pressure he'd felt to present himself as entirely self-made, the marketing advice that had encouraged him to simplify his origin story, the gradual way he'd convinced himself that acknowledging my influence would diminish his credibility. "I told myself I was protecting the brand," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse, "but I was really protecting my ego." It felt easier to pretend I'd figured everything out on my own than to admit I'd learned from someone the business world might see as irrelevant. "The business world saw me as irrelevant," I added. "But more importantly, you started seeing me as irrelevant too." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either of us had shared publicly before. Sarah's questions guided us through topics we'd never fully explored: the intersection of family love and professional ambition, the challenge of authenticity in an industry built on personal branding, the particular way that older women's contributions get systematically undervalued and overlooked. "Elaine," Sarah said about halfway through our session, "you've received thousands of messages from people who recognize their own experiences in your story. What patterns are you seeing in those responses?" "Domain themes," I replied, thinking of the comments and emails that had been arriving all week. First, the invisibility of older women's intellectual contributions, particularly in families where those contributions were given freely without formal recognition. And second, the hunger for authentic intergenerational collaboration rather than competition. "Can you elaborate on that second point?" "People are tired of generational conflict narratives," I said. "The tired tropes about older generations not understanding technology or younger generations being entitled and shallow. What they want to see is genuine partnership, older wisdom combining with younger innovation, traditional knowledge enhanced by modern platforms." Darren leaned forward. "And that's exactly what we want to build going forward, not me featuring my mum as a guest on my platform, but us creating content together as equal partners." Sarah's eyebrows rose with interest. "Tell us about that." What followed was the first public announcement of what we'd been planning all week, a new collaborative series called Wisdom in Translation, where Darren and I would explore how philosophical and literary concepts could be applied to contemporary challenges. Each episode would trace the evolution of an idea from its academic or classical origins through family conversation to practical application in modern life. "We're calling it translation because that's really what we've always done," Darren explained. "Mum would take complex concepts from literature and philosophy and translate them into language, and metaphors that I could understand as a child. Then I would translate those concepts again for my audience, putting them into contemporary context. The difference now, I added, is that we're being transparent about all levels of the translation process. People get to see how wisdom actually moves between generations, how ideas evolve through conversation and application, how family relationships can be sources of creative collaboration rather than creative limitation. Sarah spent the final segment of our interview exploring the broader implications of our story for families navigating similar dynamics. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The podcast episode generated more listener engagement than any previous installment, with thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences with family creativity, intellectual property, and generational wisdom. But the most meaningful response came from Cameron, my 12-year-old grandson, who called that evening to say he'd listened to the entire interview. "Grandma Elaine, I didn't know podcasts could be about real stuff," he said, his voice bright with excitement. "I thought they were just for entertainment or like sports and celebrities. Real stuff is often the most interesting content." I told him, "Can I be in one of your episodes? I have questions about how stories work, and Dad always says you're the expert on that." "Dad's right," I said, feeling something warm settle in my chest. "And yes, I think having multiple generations in the conversation would be wonderful." The week that followed brought a whirlwind of media appearances, interview requests, and collaboration offers that transformed both of our careers in ways neither of us had anticipated. Major publications wanted to explore our story as a case study in family intellectual property. Universities invited us to speak about intergenerational knowledge transfer. Brands reached out about partnerships that honored both our perspectives rather than asking me to fade into the background of Darren's established platform. But the most profound change was in our relationship itself, working together on content creation. We rediscovered the intellectual partnership that had been buried under years of marketing strategies and brand considerations. Darren's insights had deepened and sharpened through experience and application. My academic knowledge had gained new relevance through his ability to translate complex concepts for contemporary audiences. "You know what's funny?" Darren said. "During one of our planning sessions, I spent so much energy trying to prove I was self-made that I never realized how much more interesting the real story was." "Collaboration is always more interesting than isolation," I agreed. "Even when it's messier and more complicated." Our first Wisdom in Translation episode launched the following week, exploring the concept of resilience through the lens of both classical literature and modern psychology. The format was conversational, rather than lecture-based, with Darren and I building on each other's insights and occasionally disagreeing in ways that illuminated different aspects of the topic. The response exceeded every expectation. Within 48 hours, the episode had been downloaded to 100,000 times and generated thousands of comments from listeners who appreciated the authentic intellectual partnership they were witnessing. "This is what I've been missing in motivational content," wrote one commenter. "Not just someone telling me what to think, but getting to watch how do people with different perspectives work through ideas together. The generational element adds so much depth," wrote another. "Seeing how wisdom gets passed down, but also transformed, it makes me want to have more real conversations with my own parents and grandparents." What struck me most about the response was how hungry people seemed to be for genuine intergenerational dialogue. In a culture that often pitted older and younger generations against each other, our collaboration offered a model for how different types of knowledge and experience could enhance rather than threaten each other. Late Friday evening, as I was reviewing analytics from our first week of collaboration, I found a handwritten note that Cameron had left on my kitchen table during his last visit. In his careful 12-year-old script, he'd written, "Grandma Elaine and Dad, Thank you for showing me that families can make things together instead of just fighting about things. I want to make things with both of you when I'm older." At the bottom of the note, he'd drawn 3 stick figures standing together, each one holding what appeared to be a microphone. I photographed the note and sent it to both Darren and Ivy with the caption, "Next Generation of Wisdom Translators in Training." Darren's response was immediate. "He's right. This is so much better than anything I could have built alone." For the first time in years, I went to sleep that night feeling not just proud of my son's success, but genuinely excited about the future we were building together. The roses in the garden would bloom again next spring, and this time, they wouldn't be the only ones ready to be seen in full flower. 3 months after our first collaborative podcast episode, I stood in the green room of the Today Show, adjusting. The navy blazer Ivy had helped me select for what she called your national television debut. The blazer was new, but the confidence felt familiar, like something I'd misplaced years ago, and finally found again. Darren paced beside me, reviewing talking points on his phone with the focused energy I remembered from his childhood before important presentations. But now, instead of competitive anxiety, his preparation felt collaborative. We'd spent the previous evening discussing not just what we wanted to say, but how we wanted to say it together. 60 seconds, a production assistant announced. "Ready?" Darren asked the same question he'd posed before our first podcast interview 3 months earlier. "Ready," I said. And this time I truly was. The Today Show appearance was meant to promote our book, Wisdom in Translation, How Understanding Moves Between Generations, which would be published the following month, but it had become something more, a chance to demonstrate what authentic intergenerational collaboration looked like when both parties were committed to honesty, mutual respect, and shared credit. Hoda Karp's first question cut straight to what most people wanted to understand. "Elaine, 3 months ago you were a retired professor living quietly in Portland. Now you're co-authoring books and appearing on national television. How has this transformation felt?" "Like coming home to myself," I answered, surprised by how naturally the words came. For years, I thought supporting others meant making myself smaller. I'm learning that the most supportive thing you can do is show up as your full self and trust that there's room for everyone to shine. And Darren, you've been very public about the ways you previously handled attribution and family contributions to your work. What would you say to other creators who might be grappling with similar issues? "That authenticity is more powerful than perfection," he replied. "My audience didn't abandon me when I admitted that my wisdom came from collaboration rather than isolation. They became more engaged because they could see the real process of how insight develops and gets shared." The conversation that followed covered familiar territory, family dynamics, intellectual property, the unique challenges faced by older women seeking recognition for their contributions. But it also explored newer themes that had emerged from our collaboration, how different generations could combine their strengths, how transparency about sources actually enhanced rather than diminished credibility, how families could model the kind of authentic partnership that society desperately needed. "Your book has generated advance praise from unexpected quarters," Hoda noted. "Business schools, family therapists, even tech companies interested in mentorship models. What do you think resonates across such diverse audiences?" "The hunger for genuine connection," I said. "Whether it's in families, workplaces, or communities, people are tired of competitive dynamics that pit different groups against each other. They want to see models for how collaboration actually works, and the model you're presenting challenges some basic assumptions about success and independence," Hoda observed. "Right," Darren agreed. "The myth of the self-made entrepreneur is not just inaccurate, it's destructive. It isolates people who could be learning from each other and creates shame around acknowledging the help, guidance, and wisdom that everyone receives." After the interview, we had lunch at a small cafe near Rockefeller Center, taking time to process the surreal experience of discussing our family's private transformation on national television. 6 months ago, would you have imagined this? Darren asked, gesturing at the bustling Manhattan street outside our window. 6 months ago. I thought my story was over, I said. I thought I'd had my impact through teaching and raising you, and the rest was just maintenance. And now I realize that was just the prologue. The months since our first podcast collaboration had been a whirlwind of opportunities neither of us had anticipated. Universities wanted us to speak about intergenerational knowledge transfer. Corporations invited us to address mentorship and authentic leadership. Literary festivals included us in panels about storytelling and cultural transmission. But the most meaningful development had been the community that formed around our work. Wisdom in Translation had evolved from a podcast series into a movement, with listeners creating their own intergenerational collaboration projects, families using our framework to address their own dynamics, and organizations implementing our approaches to mentorship and knowledge sharing. The mailbox at my Portland home overflowed weekly with letters from people sharing their own stories of invisible contributions, family creativity, and generational healing. A grandmother in Michigan had started a blog with her social media influencer granddaughter. A father and son in Texas had launched a business combining traditional craft work with modern marketing. A mother and daughter in Vermont had created a workshop series about sustainable living that drew on both academic research and practical experience. You've started something bigger than either of us, Ivy had observed during one of our weekly planning sessions. She'd become our unofficial business manager, helping us navigate contracts, speaking requests, and the complex logistics of building a platform that honored both our voices equally. The financial success had been unexpected, but not unwelcome. Our podcast consistently ranked in the top 10 for family and relationship content. The book had press-sold more copies than either of our publishers had projected. Speaking engagements were booked months in advance, but more important than the external validation was the healing that had occurred within our family. Cameron, now 13, had become a regular contributor to our content, offering the perspective of someone who was witnessing wisdom transmission in real time. His questions often led us to explore concepts we might have taken for granted, and his observations frequently became the most quoted parts of our episodes. The thing I don't understand, he'd said during a recent recording about authenticity, is why anyone thought it was better to pretend you figured everything out by yourself. Don't most good ideas come from talking to people and learning from them? That comment had been shared thousands of times across social media, with people remarking on the clarity that came from seeing these dynamics through a young person's eyes. Our success had also attracted criticism, primarily from those who viewed our collaboration as opportunistic or who questioned whether family dynamics should be monetized. We'd learned to address these concerns directly, acknowledging the valid points about privacy and exploitation while maintaining that our story offered valuable insights for others navigating similar challenges. Any story shared publicly carries risks, I'd written in response to one particularly pointed critique. But the risk of silence of allowing harmful patterns to continue unexamined felt greater than the risk of vulnerability. The afternoon following our Today Show appearance, we flew back to Portland and drove straight to the garden center where Jonas and I had bought our first roses 40 years earlier. Darren wanted to plant something new in our backyard, a symbol of the growth that had emerged from such difficult soil. We selected a climbing rose variety called New Dawn, known for its resilience, repeat blooming, and ability to thrive in various conditions. As we dug the hole together, our hands dark with Portland's rich earth, I thought about the cycles of growth that had shaped our lives. Dad would have loved this, Darren said, carefully positioning the root ball. while I held the plant steady. He did love it, I said. He's the one who taught me that the most beautiful gardens require both patience and courage. Patience to let things grow in their own time, and courage to prune what isn't working. Is that what we did? Pruned what wasn't working. We did what gardens require, I said. We told the truth about what was actually growing. That evening, Cameron arrived for our weekly family dinner, a tradition we'd instituted after realizing that our public collaboration meant little if we weren't also investing in private relationship. As we cooked together, he peppered us with questions about the Today Show appearance and the book tour that would begin the following month. Are you nervous about all the traveling and speaking? He asked while helping me wash vegetables. Excited, nervous, I said. The good kind of nervous. That means you're about to do something important. What's the most important part? I considered the question while Darren set the table, the domestic routine feeling both familiar and new in the context of our transformed relationship. Showing people that it's never too late to claim your voice, I said finally, and that families can be sources of strength rather than limitation when everyone commits to truth and mutual respect. And showing people that wisdom gets better when it's shared, Darren added from across the kitchen. After dinner, Cameron pulled out his notebook, the same type of composition book his father had used at that age, now filled with insights and questions from a boy who was learning that stories have sources, that wisdom is authors, and that the best ideas often emerge from conversation between generations. I want to show you something I'm working on, he said, opening to a page covered with his careful handwriting. It's about how families can make things together instead of just arguing about who gets credit for things. As he read his essay aloud, a thoughtful exploration of collaboration and creativity that drew on examples from our family, as well as his observations of other intergenerational partnerships, I felt the same pride I'd experienced decades earlier when Darren had first shown me his childhood compositions. But this time, there was no question about attribution or acknowledgement. Cameron understood instinctively that ideas belong to communities rather than individuals, that wisdom flowed best when its sources were honored rather than erased. That's beautiful, I told him when he finished reading, and true, you've captured something important about how families can function when everyone's contributions are valued. Will you help me turn it into something I can share? He asked, like maybe a video or a blog post. Absolutely, Darren and I said simultaneously, then laughed at our synchronicity. Later that night, as I sat in Jonas's chair reading through the latest batch of letters from people whose families had been inspired by our story, I opened his journal to a passage I'd marked months earlier, but hadn't fully understood until now. Truth delayed is not truth denied. Sometimes the world needs time to catch up to what we've always known. The world had caught up. The garden was blooming in its proper season, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to tend the wisdom that had been growing quietly and persistently. All along. At 76, I was finally ready to be exactly as big as I was meant to be. The winter after our book tour ended came in slow and soft, like an apology from the sky. Portland rarely saw snow, but that December, it arrived like a whispered invitation for reflection, quiet, persistent, and blanketing everything familiar in gentle unfamiliarity. I remember waking one morning to find the garden turn ghost white, the roses asleep beneath a hush of frost, the air thick with silence. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't preparing a lecture or plotting a quiet act of rebellion against erasure. For the first time in decades, I wasn't supporting someone else's voice. I was living in my own. Our book, Wisdom in Translation, had landed on shelves with more reverence than fanfare, which was, ironically, exactly how I would have wanted it years ago, before the internet decided a life's worth was measured in views and virality. It sold steadily, not explosively, but its impact was undeniable. Reviewers called it an essential text for families navigating legacy and authorship, while one literary critic described it as a love letter from a mother to the world that forgot her. The book was taught in a few university courses by the end of the year. I received handwritten letters from students, some barely older than Darren had been, when he started quoting me for the first time, telling me I had helped them find their grandmothers again. Their mothers are themselves. Darren, and I continued. Our podcast series, Wisdom in Translation, became not just a brand, but a lifeline. Our audience grew more slowly than before, but it grew with intention. Listeners came not for spectacle, but for sanctuary. We didn't offer hacks or quick fixes. We offered something far rarer, layered conversation. Darren brought in guests he used to admire from afar, and I brought in the mentors who shaped my soul in university corridors and late-night book clubs. We weren't just bridging generations, we were braiding them together. One Sunday, as we wrapped an episode on myth-making in modern narratives, Cameron wandered into the recording room, a makeshift studio Darren had set up in the sunroom that used to hold Jonas's record collection. The boy held his latest composition notebook under one arm and a mug of cocoa in the other. Without a word, he sat between us and opened his book to a page titled, "Things I Don't Want to Forget Even When I'm Old." He read aloud, Number 1, that Grandma Elaine says wisdom is like compost, messy, slow, but it makes everything grow better. Number 2, that Dad says branding is an identity. Number 3, that stories need to name their ingredients, or else they taste fake. I didn't cry, but something inside me did soften, a place that had grown callous from decades of invisibility. That moment found its way into a bonus podcast episode. It was the most shared clip we ever posted. The real transformation, however, wasn't in our audience. It was in Darren. The man who once curated every word with surgical precision now opened episodes with admissions like, "I learned this from my mom over lasagna in 1998," or "This idea isn't mine. It came from one of Elaine's lectures on narrative frameworks." What was once radical transparency had become second nature. Attribution was no longer a threat. It was a gift he'd finally learned how to give. But with clarity comes consequence. Not everyone in Darren's orbit was thrilled with his evolution. His agent quietly stepped back from active management. A sponsorship deal with a major tech firm evaporated after he refused to tone down the collaborative focus of our podcast. His team, once a well-oiled machine of brand managers and videographers, shrank to a small group of creators who believed in conversation more than control. "I'm not losing influence," he told me one afternoon as we walked through Laurelhurst Park, the winter air pinching our cheeks pink. "I'm just redefining it." "You're choosing integrity," I corrected. "Same thing." "Eventually," he said, kicking a pin a cone toward the lake. Ivy became something of a legend in her own right. Her blog, once a humble platform for sustainable living and ethical entrepreneurship, exploded in popularity after she published a series of essays on wisdom economics, a term she coined to describe the uncredited intellectual labor that women, elders, and caregivers contribute to society without compensation or recognition. Her TEDx talk, "The Currency of Credit, Who Really Builds Our Ideas," was viewed over 3 million times. I edited the first draft of that talk. She dedicated it to me, and Mo, of course, was a constant. We called her our truth consultant. Anytime we veered too close to romanticizing the past or sugarcoating the consequences of our choices, she'd appear with her red pen and her arched eyebrow. When I asked if she was planning to write her own story, she smiled in that sly way of hers and said, "I already did. It's just waiting for the world to ask for it." I didn't push. Mo was a living archive. She'd release her story when the time was ripe. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, Darren and I remain close. But close did not mean uncomplicated. There were nights when I'd catch a glint of panic behind his eyes, a flash of the old need to control the narrative, to be the sole author of his legacy. Fame is a hungry ghost, and it doesn't release its hold easily. One evening, during a late-night planning session, I noticed him staring at an old photograph I'd placed on the mantel, a snapshot of him at age 7, sitting at our kitchen table, tongue between his teeth as he copied one of my favorite quotes into a journal. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I think I'm just realizing how much of my life I spent trying to edit out the most beautiful parts of my story." I walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We all rewrite our lives," I said. "The question is whether we're revising for truth or hiding from it." He took the photo down and held it in his hands for a long time. That week, he recorded a solo episode called The Stories We Owe Our Mothers. It went viral, not because it was polished, but because it was raw, honest, vulnerable. The man who once built an empire on curated ambition now stood before the world as a son who was still learning how to say thank you. A surprising friendship blossomed between Ivy and Cameron. They shared a quiet, curious bond, rooted in observation and questions that most adults fail to take seriously. She helped him start a zine at school, Generation Bridge, where kids interviewed their grandparents and published conversations on everything from post-war recipes to how music sounded before auto-tune. The project caught fire. Soon, middle schoolers across Portland were submitting their own interviews. Elderly neighbours once considered background characters were now sources of knowledge, humour, and legacy. One boy published a piece titled "How My Grandma Survived a Divorce with a Cassette Tape and a Frying Pan." Another girl wrote about her grandfather's theory that grief was just love stretching to make room for change. Cameron interviewed me too, asked hard questions about regret, about Jonas, about what it meant to give away ideas before I knew their worth. "You think you would have done it differently, Grandma?" he asked. I looked at him, this boy with my eyes and his father's searching mind, and said, "No, I gave freely. That was my choice. But now I choose differently, not to erase the past, but to honor it." He nodded solemnly. "Okay, that's going in the article." In the spring, we were invited to keynote a conference in Chicago called Creative Lineage, honoring the roots of innovation. The speaker lineup included artists, entrepreneurs, and scholars who all shared one thing in common: they'd built their work on the foundation of someone else's wisdom. The difference, they said so. The night before our flight, I found myself staring at my suitcase, unsure of what to pack. Not clothes, I had those, but which parts of myself to bring? The professor, the mother, the storyteller, Jonas's journal was already tucked in the side pocket. I glanced at the wedding ring I now wore on a chain around my neck. My story wasn't about choosing one role over the others. It was about claiming them all, not in spite of age, but because of it. At 77, I was living my second chapter louder than my first, not out of revenge, out of relevance, out of resurrection. And most of all, out of love. The plane ride home from the Chicago conference was quiet, not uncomfortable, just the kind of silence that follows a week of deep conversations and long days filled with connection. I looked over at Darren, slouched in the window seat, headphones in but not playing anything. He held a paper program from the event in his lap, thumbing the corner with a rhythm that told me his mind was somewhere far away. I let him sit in it. He needed the stillness. I'd spoken on stage about storytelling frameworks and cultural wisdom, and how generations pass knowledge like rivers shape valleys, subtly, insistently. Darren had followed me with a speech that was part confession, part call to action. He told the audience about the years he spent divorcing himself from the very source of his success. He said it, not with shame, but with clarity. The mistake wasn't taking my mother's words, he told them. The mistake was pretending I didn't. The crowd gave a standing ovation. But what mattered most was what he said to me backstage. "Thank you for waiting for me to grow up. I hadn't realized until then that I had been waiting, that some part of me had known he'd come back to the table eventually, not just for my wisdom, but for me." The plane dipped slightly as we began our descent into Portland, and the lights of the city blurred against the clouds. Home always looks soft from above, like memory made visible. When we landed, Darren turned to me. "You still up for that wild idea we talked about?" "You'll have to be more specific," I said. "We've had a few lately." "The Institute," he said, "the place where people can come and study this stuff. Family wisdom, narrative origin, real mentorship across generations." "Ah, that idea. You mean the Wisdom House?" He grinned. "I still think it's the right name. A place where people learn to honor the shoulders they stand on." I smiled, thinking of Jonas, Mo and Ivy and Cameron. Of Darren at 8 years old, declaring that dreams wore their Sunday best. Of the notebooks and journals and lessons that had filled a lifetime. "Let's do it," I said. "Let's build a place where memory has architecture." It took us a year, 12 months of fundraising, permitting, networking, and brainstorming. But we did it. In the spring of the following year, the Whitmore Institute for Narrative Legacy opened in a renovated craftsman house just 2 blocks from my own. We painted it sunflower yellow and planted roses in the garden from cuttings I'd saved. Inside, we set up reading rooms, recording booths, and a seminar hall with a sunlit alcove for journaling and quiet conversations. Ivy called it a cathedral. For untold stories, we offered workshops in intergenerational storytelling, mentorship ethics, and attribution history. We brought in librarians, oral historians, cultural anthropologists, and poets. We taught digital literacy to seniors and listening skills to teens. One room was devoted to what Darren called Wisdom Archives, a digital collection of submitted stories and lessons from families across the globe. "Let's be the place where wisdom is finally traceable," he said. Our most popular course, The Credit Question, Giving Name to Invisible Work. It was based on our own story, but had grown into something universal. Students from as far as Cape Town and Dublin enrolled in our virtual version. Grandmothers zoomed in with their grandchildren. Fathers shared recipes that doubled as survival metaphors. A retired firefighter submitted a video titled "How to Know When to Let It Burn." I cried when I watched it. One afternoon, Cameron helped me catalogue a new stack of story donations. "Do you think people will remember us after we're gone?" he asked, turning over a printed submission from a woman who'd raised 5 daughters on a farm in Idaho. "Maybe," I said. "But what matters is that they remember themselves because of us." He seemed satisfied with that. The more public we became, the more invitations we received. By the second year of the Institute, I was traveling monthly, keynotes, university panels, even a guest spot on a documentary series about cultural inheritance. I learned to navigate airports like lecture halls, always with a folder of quotes from Jonas's journal in my bag, and an extra pair of reading glasses. Darren came with me when he could. Sometimes Ivy joined too, especially when we spoke about digital identity and community platforms. But often, I went alone, and that was something I'd had to learn how to love again: solitude with purpose. Movement that didn't center around anyone else's needs. It surprised me how much I adored the independence. At 78, I was more mobile than some people half my age. I carried stories across continents, stitched invisible threads between families who thought their wisdom had died out. I watched women cry in hotel conference rooms because someone finally said what they'd known for years: "You're not just supportive, you're foundational." We started getting letters from teachers who rewrote their syllabi, adding units on legacy and intergenerational ethics. One high school English department created a project called Ghost Writers, where students had to trace where their ideas really came from. not just books, but people, grandparents, coaches, bus drivers, caregivers, siblings, Darren read. Some of those aloud on our podcast. My favorite was a simple sentence from a 17-year-old. I realized my voice is actually an echo. That doesn't make it smaller, it makes it older. That summer, Mo was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, she told me over tea, as if reading grocery lists. I've had a good run. Whitmore. Don't look at me like that. I didn't say anything. Just reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I want you to have my archives, she said. All of it. My teaching materials, my journals. The column clippings, the letters from students. You know what to do with them, I nodded. I'll make sure people remember. No, she said. I don't care if they remember me. I care if they keep questioning. That's how you know you mattered. If the questions outlive you. She passed peacefully 3 months later. Her funeral was stand-in room only. Ivy spoke. So did Darren. But it was Cameron who read the quote. Mo had underlined in red a decade ago in a copy of To the Lighthouse. Nothing was simply one thing. The other always existed. I placed Mo's marked-up novel in the Wisdom archives the next day. And then I cried. Not for the first time. Not for the last. The third season of our podcast debuted with a special theme, what we inherit. We explored everything, values, fears, habits, expectations. How silence gets passed down like china. How resilience hides in recipes. How shame travels like smoke through locked doors. One of our guests, a social worker named Lena from Toronto, said something that stayed with me for weeks. We inherit not just who they were, but who they were afraid to become. It made me wonder what fears I'd handed down to Darren, and what courage he'd handed back. In episode 5, we interviewed Ivy, who by then had launched her own platform dedicated to ethical collaboration and sustainable thought leadership. I asked her on air what had surprised her most about our story's reach. She didn't hesitate. How many people needed permission to value their own knowledge? She turned to me. Elaine, you didn't just tell your story. You told everyone they were allowed to have one too. The Institute celebrated its 5th anniversary with a reunion event called The Return of the Origin Stories. Attendees came from all over, former students, podcast listeners, mentees, even families who had shared stories through our online portal. Some brought printouts of their wisdom trees, little genealogies not of people, but of ideas. This phrase came from my aunt. This metaphor from my father's bedtime stories. This belief from my grandma's garden. I stood at the front steps of the Institute and watched them arrive, faces alight with recognition. Some carried flowers, others carried journals. One woman approached with tears in her eyes and handed me a Tupperware of lemon bars. You said once that recipes are memory in code, she said. These are my mom's. I want you to have them. I held that Tupperware like a holy object. When I finally stepped up to the podium under the late summer sky, I saw Darren, Ivy, and Cameron in the front row. 3 generations. One story still unfolding. I began with a quote from Jonas's journal. One we hadn't shared before. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build, so others can move forward faster. Then I added my own, and sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth about who taught you to dream. I turned 80 last fall. Ivy organized a small dinner party. Darren tried to make it a full media event. I vetoed him. No. Cameras, I said. Just candles, he nodded. You're the boss. Cameron gave me a gift, a bound version of Generation Bridge, now a full-fledged digital magazine with thousands of contributors. On the inside cover, he wrote, to Grandma Elaine, for showing me that inheritance isn't money, it's meaning. I touched his cheek, remembering the boy who used to crawl into my lap with questions like, what's a metaphor again? And why do you cry when you read books? You're becoming quite the translator yourself, I said. He smiled. I had the best teacher. Some nights, I still sit in Jonas's old leather chair. The journal is fraying at the edges now, dog-eared and beloved, but I no longer read it with longing. I read it with gratitude for the man who believed truth, took time for the son who eventually remembered where his truth came from, for the stories I waited too long to tell, but told anyway, and for the world that finally listened. The garden blooms every year now, stubborn, wild, joyful. The roses climb higher than ever, like they're reaching for something not even they can name. And me? I bloom too, not quietly, not invisibly, but fully. At last. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.